Our next guest, Michael Shank, is an adjunct professor at New York University's Center for Global Affairs and George Mason University's Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. He's also has a really phenomenal Newsweek op-ed out that really is quite thought-provoking on these issues, and I invited him to come on the show and talk more about it. He tweets at Michael_Shank, SHANK. Welcome to the show. How are you, Michael?
Hey, Laura. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm glad you're here. You know, I came across your op-ed, and it was around the time when the comments and conversations were around, will President Biden officially call Vladimir Putin a war criminal? Will he not? The vice president had alluded to it. It has been more of a universal conversation now these days, in the days since your op-ed came out. But in it, you write, prosecute Putin for war crimes, but prosecute the U.S. too, maybe? Tell me a little bit about why. Let's start with the more obvious notions, I would say, in terms of what has been the part of the zeitgeist, as to Vladimir Putin being prosecuted for war crimes. It's not, as a colloquial conversation, not a difficult thing to talk about, but is it a heavier lift in reality?
It is a heavier lift in reality, and there are reasons for that. Russia is not, Ukraine is not, and the U.S. is not a state party to the Rome Statute, which was created at the end of the 1990s and then entered into force in 2002. That would make it easier for anyone, including the U.S., to file it and call for an investigation. Being a state party to the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court, gives you more rights when referring countries to the ICC for investigation. And so going forward, it would be great if a result of this horrific war would be U.S. doubling down on its commitment to the ICC. It hasn't supported the ICC in the past and is not a state party to the ICC. So in terms of referring anything to the ICC when you're a state party, again, which Russia, Ukraine, and U.S. are not, when you're a state party to the ICC, it just makes it easier to refer something to the ICC for investigation. Now, Ukraine has been able to move on an investigation because the ICC statute does allow a state, even if it hasn't ratified the ICC statute, the Rome Statute, to, on an ad hoc basis, accept the ICC's jurisdiction over crimes committed on its territory or by its nationals. And so Ukraine did that in 2014 and again in 2015. And so that's why they have enabled ICC jurisdiction over war crimes happening in country. And so there is an ad hoc basis allowed, but ideally, coming out of this, Russia, Ukraine, and U.S. would say, hey, we're going to, I know it's a big ask and a big lift, but hey, we're going to support the ICC going forward. The other way to do it is through a Security Council referral. And given that Russia and the U.S. are both permanent voting members with P5 on the UN Security Council, it makes it very difficult for any referral to come out of the UN Security Council as a result.
And also because they hold veto power over any recommendation if they were to recommend that. And for that reason, there have been discussions about Russia being removed from the UN Security Council. Is that a practical option?
That recommendation came out of some members of Congress. That's not feasible in the short term. I don't see that happening, though I certainly support a reform of the UN Security Council. The P5 is problematic in a host of ways, including last year, just a quick side note, there was a conversation on whether or not to include climate change in the UN Security Council's mandate, something I've written on in the past with Congressman Meeks, who's the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and Russia stopped that from happening. And so this P5 is problematic for a host of reasons: human rights violations, ICC referrals, climate being included in the mandate of the UN Security Council, which Russia stopped. So I'm in favor of reform that gets rid of the P5 entirely. Kicking Russia off the P5, the permanent five with the veto power, as you note, I don't see that moving anytime soon. Maybe in the future there'll be a discussion about it, but I don't see that moving.
If there is elimination of the P5, what is the viable alternative? Are you saying the Security Council as it functions now is just not effective and there's a reason to do away with that aspect of it? Or is there a more viable alternative you'd be proposing?
Yeah, so the P5 was created under different war scenarios coming out of World War II, and it doesn't reflect the security realities of today or the power dynamics of today. So I'm in favor of a rethink on the UN Security Council so that it can really tackle emerging conflicts like climate conflict, which it hasn't yet. In terms of holding war criminals accountable, I think the most viable route forward with Putin and any targeting that he's done to civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, and ICC investigators are analyzing that now because they want to assess whether it was intentional or not. So the intentional targeting of civilian infrastructure or civilians or hospitals, et cetera, they're really trying to assess whether it's intentional. Given that Ukraine has invited the ICC statute, and they did it in 2014, as I mentioned, given that they've invited it in as an ad hoc, the ICC can move forward with an investigation. So setting aside the Security Council, since Russia, as a veto member of the P5, won't allow that to move forward, Ukraine's ad hoc relationship right now with the ICC statute allows a conversation to happen about accountability for war crimes.
So in terms of what that accountability might look like, I mean, obviously there is the declaration that somebody is a war crime. There's the heavy lift you speak about in terms of actually carrying that through. There has not, to my knowledge, ever been a sitting leader prosecuted by the ICC. And as you mentioned, Russia and Ukraine are not parties to it in this respect. So is the declaration purely symbolic, or is there some rhyme or reason in terms of having a international censure of Russia and even the statement alone?
So the ICC covers 4 different crimes, and I just want to mention them here because they'll be helpful for the conversation. Genocide is one of the crimes that the ICC can investigate, crimes against humanity, and then these next 2 are more relevant to Russia and ultimately to other war criminals that I mentioned in my op-ed, including the U.S., specifically President Bush and President Obama. But that's where we get into breaches of Geneva Conventions, which Russia and U.S. have supported. So in the 40s and then updates to the protocols in the 70s, the Geneva Conventions deal with things like targeting civilians or prisoners of war. And that's where we get into torture, certainly Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, and any torture or targeting of civilians or prisoners of war comes into this 3rd war crime. And then the 4th war crime that the ICC jurisdiction covers is crime of aggression. And so that's when a country is invading another country and undermining their sovereignty or their integrity or the independence of another state. So the conversations for Putin in Ukraine will center primarily around these latter 2 war crimes, which breach the Geneva Conventions, targeting civilians potentially, and then a war crime of aggression where Putin is undermining the sovereignty of another state. This state is Ukraine.
In many respects, the idea of declaring him a war criminal and talking about that from those 4 categories and what you're spoken about really is the floor of these issues, not the ceiling. But with your op-ed, what I think is really interesting about, in particular, is the idea, and I'm obviously, being colloquial in this, and that people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. And in some respect, you articulate that the United States is that very occupant of the glass house, and be careful the stones you hurl when you're talking about war crimes. And you just mentioned it. You talked about President Bush and President Obama as people you think should be fairly at least evaluated in that same context. Tell us why.
So as a professor at NYU and as a professor at George Mason University's Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, I'm teaching graduate students in the future of foreign policy and international development. And when we talk about international law, everyone's been talking about international law as it pertains to Putin contravening world order and international law. I am just as keen as all of those folks speaking about Putin contravening international law. I'm just as keen to hold up these principles and make sure they're legitimate and have integrity. And if we want them to be legitimate and have integrity, if we want the ICC and the Rome Statute to have value and be relevant going forward, all I'm calling for in that piece is consistent application of ICC jurisdiction. And so if we think about Bush, and again, intentional targeting of civilians or intentional torture or intentional crimes of aggression, both with Bush and Obama, you see that. You see torture intentionally, Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo as examples. You see civilian targets. In Bush's case, we bombed the ICRC Red Cross sites several times, even after it was placed off limits by the military. So it was placed off limits after we bombed it the first time, and then we bombed it again. And so there's some intentionality there. And then in terms of crimes of aggression for Bush, the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan fit into that jurisdiction in terms of invasion of a sovereign nation. Now, Obama, same thing. Torture, civilian targets and aggression. On the civilian side, we bombed hospitals run by Doctors Without Borders, MSF, in Afghanistan, even after MSF notified the military saying, hey, this is a civilian hospital, we have patients here, we still bombed it. And so intentional targeting of civilians with both Bush and Obama, and then with Obama, crimes of aggression in terms of invading sovereign nations. We did it with Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, and with drone strikes, again, similar crimes of aggression because we're talking about airspace invasion of sovereign nations. So what I call for in that piece is accountability across the board. Yes, let's send war criminals to the ICC. Yes, let's be state parties to the ICC. Yes, let's hold war criminals account, but let's just do it consistently. Otherwise, these statutes have no moral weight whatsoever, have no normative weight whatsoever, because people see the inconsistencies in application.
Given what you've said, what do you think, and I ask you to play your own devil's advocate in this piece, and this notion of what do you think is that the U.S.'s position would be in defense of the actions you've spoken about that would distinguish it, quite frankly, from the actions of Vladimir Putin? Obviously, we're talking about whenever there's a conversation about the declaration of or accountability, there must be the appetite and the palate in order to do these things. And the U.S. would obviously have a very different position than what you've articulated as to whether they have engaged in war crimes. Now, obviously, we can go back further, the Enola Gay and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I think there's a much less of a argument that could be made, although all of that predated what we talked about in the Geneva Conventions. And so, while it may have been under the categories we're talking about now, not ripe for the same conversation at that point in time, but certainly what you've talked about now would fall under that post-Geneva Convention world. So they would distinguish themselves. Is there any weight to their distinguishing themselves?
Right. So after I ran that piece, there's a lot of pushback, people justifying civilian death in U.S. wars, and Brown University does a cost of war, and they've seen, they've counted up the civilians dead that have died as a direct result of our U.S. wars, and they have it at 387,000 civilians have died, violent deaths, because of our wars, and another 37 million people have been displaced from our war on terror. Now, what I've seen in the public is a justification of these deaths as collateral damage, or a contestation of the assertion that this was intentional. Now, I do not envy ICC investigators, because to assert intentionality in any of this, whether it's Putin or Obama or Bush, can't be easy. Now, we do have track records, so my points about Bush targeting ICRC Red Cross sites multiple times, even after it was placed on a list where the military shouldn't target. This also happened in Libya with NATO targets. They were targeting non-military sites that they knew were non-military. Then we have a track record. Then you get to see, Obama still targeted this MSF hospital in Kunduz even after Doctors Without Borders alerted the military to the fact that it was a civilian hospital. So when you have that track record, it's a little easier, I assume. I'm not an investigator at the ICC, but I'm assuming it's a little easier to assess intentionality. And that's the work at hand. Was Putin intentional in targeting civilian infrastructure and hospitals? How do we prove that? Was Bush and Obama intentional in targeting civilian infrastructure, hospitals, weddings, etc.? There are always apologies after the fact, and apologies are trying to wash over what happened. The U.S. Department of Defense has done that with several war zone civilian deaths, apologizing after the fact. But this is really up to the investigators. But I do hope that America is talking about war crimes like they've never talked before. And they're talking about the ICC. Like, Americans on the street now know what the ICC is, and they know what the Rome Statute is, and they know what Geneva Conventions are, which is amazing. It's an incredible opportunity for us as an international community to double down on these institutions, to lift them up, to reaffirm and reify them so that they have moral weight, normative weight, and legal power to hold criminals of all stripes from any nation accountable. And as someone who has worked in a lot of these war zones in Yemen and Somalia and Pakistan, Afghanistan, Syria, Iran, seeing and hearing the frustration there for lack of accountability there for what Bush and Obama did, and to some extent Trump and Bush Sr. did there, we're only creating more anti-American anger and propaganda if we don't lift up consistently the jurisdiction of the ICC now while simultaneously holding Putin account. So accountability across the board is what I'm looking for. It's not going to be easy, but I hope we pursue it.
Yeah, there's an interesting study a couple of years ago. It was done by Scott Sagan, a professor of poli-sci, and he co-authored a study that really examined, a Stanford professor, who examined Americans' attitudes toward the ethical and legal responsibilities of soldiers in an armed conflict. Now, that was between two hypothetical countries back in 2019. And what it found, I think it lends to your point very well, what it found was that almost half of Americans are willing to allow a war crime, a massacre of innocent women and children, to go unpunished when they believe the act was committed by soldiers fighting for a just cause. Now, when I bring this up because I mention again, playing out, as you speak about accountability and consistency, requires the willingness of the electorate, of the governing bodies, as well as the countries who are on the particular moral high ground, to be willing to cede it in some way or to admit through transparency that they agree with your assessment. And I do wonder if playing it out and the ideas of thinking about equating, in some respects, the actions of one nation that is far more favored than, say, Russia, is that part of the issue here that you articulate, that the idea of being this sort of favored nation cannot undermine or influence the way in which we perceive our moral compass?
Boy, you stated so eloquently, Laura, and I'm so thankful that you're giving space to this conversation. I really appreciate it because not many people are. So props and kudos to you for creating space for this conversation. And you're absolutely right. There is an exceptionalism here that is preventing accountability that would garner favor around the world. Like, I think countries watching would have higher esteem and respect for a government that says, listen, we're going to hold Putin accountable to the war crimes. Simultaneously, we're going to look at our past as well. I recognize that this is a Herculean effort, and Obama didn't want to do it with Bush, and certainly Trump didn't do it with Obama, and Biden doesn't want to do it with Obama either because they're close, and I recognize that's probably not going to happen. But for anyone who doubts what I'm talking about, please just Google war crimes Obama, war crimes Bush. What I'm referencing is not extreme stuff. It's published in legitimate outlets, from The Atlantic to The Guardian. Books have been published about war crimes in the Bush era, Harvard writing about war crimes in the Obama era. And so these aren't extreme claims. And I want people to, of course, do their own research to see for themselves the legitimate accounting of targeting of civilian infrastructure, of torture, which we know about because the media published a lot on it, but also crimes of aggression in terms of invading sovereign nations. The risk in pulling the exceptional favored nation status card right now is that all the countries that have been invaded by us in a crime of aggression are watching. And if you are tracking what they're saying on social media, because a lot of my friends are in these countries and they are pissed that potentially we hold one war criminal accountable in the ICC and we let go of recent ones because we don't want to touch them because of the favored nation status that you're talking about, Laura. So this is an opportunity to lift up the ICC and the Rome Statute, to become a state party to it, which I hope Russia, Ukraine, and the US do. We need to. Over 100 countries have, but we haven't. And this is an opportunity to inform and educate the American public about the Geneva Conventions, about war crimes, what it means, about the ICC, the importance of it. And so I see this as an opportunity to educate, lift up, reaffirm these norms and values and institutional order that we care so much about, but we have to do it consistently.
You know, if you were to play that out to the logical conclusion, and I do wonder, because here we are no longer in the hypothetical where these conversations are confined to the classrooms and thinking about let's just say hypothetically this were to happen. What do you think would be the impact of not just the idea of, you said that you think there'd be greater respect that was conferred to the United States. Many would argue that there would be less respect conferred to the United States because we have been so adamant that we have not engaged in this behavior, except in the most extraordinary of times where it was not anticipated. And you can talk about all the different exceptions they've raised, Guantanamo Bay being one example that has been talked about. Obviously, that policy has changed and discussions around it. But where do you see that in terms of the global standing at a time like now? If the United States were to say, you know what, we need to evaluate our own behavior under the umbrella of war crimes. But it doesn't change the fact that Putin must be held accountable. Does that logistically, does that stop the evaluation of a Putin? Does that mean that we are elevated in a different way? One person's life is as valuable as the next. So the clock has been ticking, according to you, for quite some time on us being able to evaluate those things. But play that out for us intellectually in terms of how that would play out right now in real time in the ability of the United States, a member of NATO, to condemn the behavior of a Vladimir Putin. Are we past the point of no return where the U.S. then could ever condemn the behavior of another nation?
That's a great question. So when I bring this up on social media and I share the article, people say, you're taking away from the severity of the war now. That's a distraction. And you didn't ask that question, but you raised the question of, like, how do we hold Putin accountable to the ICC jurisdiction while simultaneously talking about our accountability within the ICC jurisdiction, the Rome Statute? So I think it's both and. We can do both. Yes, we need to proceed at pace right now because the war is in real time right now with accountability right now. So Putin should absolutely be the priority in terms of ICC investigation, no question, because it's happening right now and we have an opportunity to prevent loss of life, stop targeting of civilian infrastructure, end the war, etc. Priority number one. And simultaneously have a conversation, at least a legitimate conversation in policy circles in DC, on the Hill, about accountability across the board. I think there's a lot of opportunity here to, again, earn favor, but we do need to prioritize Putin, no question there, and simultaneously have a conversation about accountability across the board. You know, I just want to add two more things because I know we're coming on time. I think the media has done a phenomenal job telling the story of how horrible, how awful war is. And I haven't seen that level of storytelling so freely in our war zones. And there are reasons for that, because a lot of times reporters get embedded with the DoD, the Pentagon, and so they're limited in what they can storytell. But having been in a lot of our war zones and seen the reporting out from Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, etc., Iraq, there's a definite difference, and media has talked about some of those differences. But for the American people to see the horrors of our wars too is so essential. Otherwise, they have nothing to base a potential accountability call on. Like, if they haven't seen the horrors of our drone strikes, if they haven't seen Bush bombing a Red Crescent maternity hospital in Iraq, if they haven't seen Obama do a double tap drone strike where they strike a car and then emergency personnel come to rescue, and then they strike it again, which kills the emergency first responders, which is a war crime. If they haven't seen those pictures, if they haven't seen those footage like we're seeing coming out of Ukraine, I get it. Americans don't have a reference point. They don't have a heuristic. They don't have a reference point of, like, oh, we did this in Iraq. We did this in Afghanistan. We did this in Yemen. We did this in Somalia, because the media didn't report it. We didn't see it. It wasn't shown. So one thing I'm thinking about, watching what's happening, knowing that Biden and future presidents will continue to do airstrikes and drone strikes in some of these countries, I want to go back to these countries and storytell some more so that the American public can see what's going on, can see what's happening. And that's why I went to some of these war zones, so I could report out and show and storytell what's happening so that the American public gets the full story. So again, in terms of consistency, yes, let's get ICC jurisdiction consistently applied to war criminals. And yes, let's get media consistently reporting and storytelling what's happening on the ground in war zones, because it changes the way we call for accountability. And that's the discrepancy there in terms of how media has covered Ukraine versus how media has covered wars, our wars in the Middle East, North Africa, Horn of Africa, Central Asia, South Asia. World of difference, and it does impact how the American public calls for accountability based on what they've seen or what they haven't seen.
A very thought-provoking piece. Thank you for taking the time to discuss it here on the show. I appreciate it, Michael Shank.
So great talking to you. Thanks for making time for this.